excited to be able to not only have a conversation today about an interactive mapping tool that will help you at least get a better picture of digital adoption and access in your community, but also to hear local perspectives from people who are working with local officials. So to get started, I want to make sure that we get a chance to give just an overview of a little bit of what's happening on the federal broadband mapping landscape. So I will turn it over to Senior Policy Counsel Ryan Johnston to share an update.
Hi, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone, based on from where you're coming in from. Like Francella said, my name is Ryan Johnston. I'm a Senior Policy Counsel here at Next Century Cities, focused mainly on our federal portfolio. And really what I want to do is touch on kind of where we are in the broadband mapping landscape. So about 3 weeks ago, the FCC released their maps under the Broadband Data Act. And what it did is it started the clock running on the public broadband availability challenge. So that availability challenge will be running until about the 13th of January, and the Fabric challenge has been running since about September 1st. So what this means is that we're currently kind of in the midst of these two challenge processes, one to make sure that we know where all of the broadband serviceable locations across the nation are, and the other to make sure is that they are accurately representing what broadband looks like on the ground for those people that are served by the internet service providers there. As of when January 13th rolls around, the NTIA plans to use that kind of as a cutoff for what will ultimately impact the allocations that they plan to make for BEAD funding for the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. And then they said that they intend to make those allocations by the 30th of June. So right now, it actually can't be overstated just how important it is that the FCC hears from as many people as possible, just letting them know what does connectivity look like on the ground where you are. If you have a chance to look at the maps, to look at where your home is, where your friends' homes are, where the businesses that you frequent are, to make sure that that they're on the maps, and two, that the data that accurately reflects what broadband looks like there. Even if you don't have a specific challenge, letting the FCC know what broadband looks like to you is critical to actually ensuring that the maps are as accurate as possible. So if you have any questions about anything regarding the maps, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I'll drop my email in the chat, or anybody over at our team. And I'll also take a chance to plug two things. One, we have a resource page on our website, as well as the Broadband Resource Hub, where we, as well as several of our nonprofit partners, have been putting together an innumerable amount of good resources on mapping. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Ryan. And I also want to give a shout out to people who are dropping their in the chat. Boston, Massachusetts is represented well here. We have UC Santa Barbara, we have Ohio, Maryland, City of New York, Illinois, Georgia Tech from Atlanta, Oakland, California, Buffalo, New York, Annapolis, Maryland, Idaho, Los Angeles, California, and all sorts of places. So thank you so much for tuning in, you guys. Next, we want to make sure that as core to our program, we are always elevating local officials. So it's really important that we actually get to hear from a community leader who is working with local officials to implement broadband programs on the ground. Next, you are going to hear from Will Pfeffer. He hails from Colorado and works as a civic technologist at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council that serves communities in greater Boston area. His portfolio focuses on community-based projects that involve broadband access in public and affordable housing, digital literacy, and device access. Prior to joining MAPC, he worked as a consultant for Metro Lab Network, which some of you may know, supporting recipients of the National Science Foundation's Civic Innovation Challenge. He was also a senior program manager at Code for America, supporting the organization's National Volunteer Network as a program coordinator. These days, Will is in the Boston area. He works at he prefers marathons and volunteers with Code for Boston. We're really lucky to have him here talking today about some of the communities that he's working with to improve connectivity. So thank you very much, Will, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Francella. Chris, maybe we could, oh, yep, there we go. Maybe we can share the screen again there. Yeah, as Francella said, my name is Will Pfeffer. I'm a civic technologist at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, or MAPC. MAPC is the regional planning agency which serves greater Boston, Massachusetts. As you can see on the map here, we represent the 101 cities and towns that make up greater Boston, and it represents roughly half of the population of the state, maybe a little bit under, but a pretty sizable portion of the state. So we are a fairly large organization, and most of my colleagues here do more traditional urban and regional planning work. We work on housing, transportation, economic development, and many other issues. My role sits within our data services department, which includes our digital team, of which I'm a part, as well as researchers and analysts who support many of our other departments and produce the maps that I'll share in a moment. I include this organizational context in order to make the point that digital equity is something that municipalities can and should plan for, in the same way that a municipality might do a housing production plan or an economic development plan. So municipal governments and city planners really do have a role to play here. In addition to planning, a lot of the digital equity work that we do here at MAPC involves using federal funding to procure Wi-Fi network equipment and internet service at public and affordable housing sites to build the physical infrastructure that would allow people to enjoy a reliable, high-speed, and in most cases, free connection in their homes. This is a big part of our work and certainly one we're very proud of. We don't actually have time to get super deep into it today, so I'll leave that portion there as a teaser and just encourage anyone who's interested in that to check out our website at mapc.org or reach out to me directly. Before we move on to the next slide, which we'll do in a moment, I just want to say for some context that a lot of this work was part of a digital equity plan, or a lot of the work that I'll highlight was part of a digital equity plan that we at MAPC produced and released this fall for the cities of Chelsea, Everett, and Revere, Massachusetts, which are 3 cities just north of Boston, as I'm sure, given the good representation the area has, many folks in the chat know. As well as some ongoing work that we're doing with the city of Quincy, which is just south of Boston. For folks that do happen to be in Massachusetts, and especially if you're a municipal employee, you should know that there's a ton of funding right now through the Massachusetts Broadband Institute, which is our statewide broadband office, to produce these municipal digital equity plans at no cost to the municipality. There's some great info both on the MAPC website as well as the Mass Broadband Institute website about how to apply for this program, which we are participating in. So I really highly encourage anybody who has a municipal role to take a look. All right, so moving a little closer to the topic at hand today and on to the next slide, if you would, I'd like to share some of the ways in which we've used different data sources as part of the digital equity planning process. We use these maps in 2 ways. First, asset mapping or existing conditions analysis is important to any planning process because it allows you to understand what exists already and where there are gaps. This helps decision makers understand where the challenges and opportunities lie and gives them a place to start when thinking about interventions. Second, and really speaking of interventions, we use maps like these as tools to help us prioritize the infrastructure investments that I mentioned a moment ago. They allow us to make decisions that are informed by data, and the visual aid of a map can be a super powerful tool in communicating with decision makers who can say yes or no to specific interventions, specific investments in infrastructure. The map that I'm showing here on the screen is based primarily on American Community Survey or ACS data. ACS table S2801 and a couple of other tables focus on computer and internet use and ask questions about what type of internet connection people have at home, what their access to devices like laptops, tablets, and smartphones look like, and other related info. What we've done here is just map the proportion of residents without an internet connection. So the darker the color, the higher proportion of people that lack an internet connection in their home. We've mapped that in the city of Quincy, Massachusetts, and overlaid that with some other community assets, libraries, schools, community health centers, and public housing. This allows us to look at digital equity in context. So you can think of this as a more systemic or an intersectional approach. On this map, you'll also notice some dark blue lines, which are internet carrier fiber optic lines. We'll talk about those a little bit more on the next slide, which we can move to now. So I don't know if this is universal around the country, but at least here in Massachusetts, it's very common that in the cable franchise agreement that a municipality holds with an ISP, this is basically the legal agreement that allows a company like Comcast to dig up streets and put in wires. There will be a section that allows the municipality to request a map of all the fiber assets that the ISP owns in that city or town. These maps are not generally available to the public, but a municipal government should be able to access them, at least where that's included in the cable franchise agreement. So in this map, we've looked at the fiber network. In this case, this is fiber owned by Comcast and RCN, which are the only carriers with fiber infrastructure in the cities of Chelsea, Everett, and Revere. And honestly, something like 80% of this fiber is owned by Comcast. RCN is a smaller player. our GIS team has done some analysis to determine what proportion of any given census block is within 200 feet of that fiber line. So basically, the idea is that 200 feet is more or less the maximum distance over which a copper line can carry internet traffic without that traffic starting to slow down. Or sort of put more simply, if you have more than 200 feet of copper cabling between you and a fiber line, you really can't take advantage of that high-speed fiber line. So this gives us a sense of what proportion of people within any block are even physically able to be served by the infrastructure that exists in their city. So there are a handful of other data sources that we've used in municipal digital equity planning, which aren't represented in these maps in specific, but that I would like to mention. So we do use some speed test data, both from MLab, which is the organization that operates the little speed test widget that you'll find if you do a Google search for speed test, as well as some data from Microsoft that's available, I believe, at the census block group level, so a little bit less granular than this, that shows download speed specifically captured as people download Microsoft products. And then we didn't use this data in these plans specifically, but speed test data from Ookla, which runs speedtest.net, is also available. That's available for a fee. And then beyond quantitative data, which most of these maps are showing, when we did this digital equity plan for Chelsea, Everett, and Revere, as well as a smaller scale plan that we did in a neighborhood in Boston that we're working with, where we're working with an affordable housing developer, we did pretty large qualitative surveys in multiple languages. So in Chelsea, Everett, and Revere, we reached over 2,000 people with this survey that asked them about their experience with broadband, so including speed, reliability, affordability, and like just a lot more granular detail that we really don't see in ACS data. But also we asked about the other aspects of digital equity. So digital equity is not just broadband connections. We ask, do they have a reliable and appropriate device? Do they feel comfortable using that device? Do they have places they can turn for help when something isn't working right or when they want to learn a new skill? Are these resources available in a language that they're comfortable using? All these more human questions get at what's really important, which is understanding the experience people are having with using the internet at home. So I'll wrap up here, and we can move on to the next slide by talking more broadly about digital equity planning. So there are federal resources becoming available through BEAD, which is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. And part of those resources are dedicated to state-level broadband planning. I believe that there is a requirement as part of that funding that the state-level broadband plans have to consider local input or some sort of similarly vague language. Here in Massachusetts, the Mass Broadband Institute has taken that sort of a step further, and they're requiring that the statewide plan incorporate any regional or municipal plans that exist. So not only do these municipal plans inform infrastructure investments in communities, but they also ensure that local voices are represented in the statewide plan that will be produced down the road. Finally, as I mentioned up top, if you are a municipal employee in Massachusetts and you haven't yet considered applying to do a digital equity plan through this MBI program, the Mass Broadband Institute program, please do think about doing so. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me directly, and I can help convince you of its importance. So I think I'm out of time, so I'll leave it here. But once again, I'll just encourage anyone to visit our website. There's a short link here, as well as my email address, which you can use to reach out to me directly with questions. And I think I'll pass it back to you, Francella.
Thank you so much for that, Will. And for those of you who are listening, if you have any questions, again, please don't be shy about dropping questions in the chat, and then also feeling free to email us directly. Also, Will will share his email just like it was on the last slide. I also want to offer an NCC prize pack to the first person who can tell me true or false that Will was a competitive mountain biker in the state of Colorado. True or false? First one. Ooh, David Greening. Please drive. And yes, several people know that's true. So thank you very much.
You really did your research. I appreciate that.
Everybody knows I do my homework before I show up everywhere. So thank you so much for sharing with us today. And now we get to talk a little bit about an initiative's work that I have been following for now. This is my second year. And I got familiar with specifically Dean Bhaskar Chakravorty last year when I was doing research on digital equity and really just trying to understand the economic impact of that nationwide. You'll get to hear from him directly, but I'll tell you a little bit about him, his background. He's the Dean of the Business School at the Dean of Global Business at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and the founding executive director of Fletcher's Institute for Business in the Global Context. He's also chair of Digital Planet. His experience in academia, strategy consulting, and high-tech research and development gives him a very robust view of what we need in terms of creating solutions and who we need for partnerships. He's previously served on the faculties at Harvard University and University of Illinois. He's also served as a partner at McKinsey and at a place formerly known as Bell Labs. He's an accomplished author. I found his book on Amazon and has bylines in New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and other places. Those closest to him know that he is great at playing squash. He's an animal lover who just recently welcomed a dog into his home. And it's really an honor just to be able to not only hear his insights, but hear how he's using his leadership to make sure that we are grooming the next generation of advocates. So thank you so much, Bhaskar, for joining us.
Well, thank you for having us, Francella, and thank you to all of you for joining. This is such a privilege to have a chance to share some of our work with you. And the purpose of the work that we shall spend the rest of the time for this seminar is to help you and to help our nation close the digital divide, which unfortunately people have been living with on a day-to-day basis, but has basically hit the radar in Washington, D.C. and a number of other places because of the pandemic. So it took a pandemic to take the cover off of the massive gap that we experience, digitally speaking, across the world, and certainly right here in the United States, which is one of the most digitally advanced country in the world. So just by way of a quick background, I'm at the Fletcher School, which is the oldest exclusively graduate school of global affairs in the United States, routinely counted as among the preeminent schools of global affairs anywhere in the world. And I started a research program called Digital Planet. As part of Digital Planet, we have an initiative which goes by the acronym of IDEA, and IDEA stands for Imagining a Digital Economy for All. Now, I don't need to tell any of you why it's important to be a part of that digital economy and making sure that everyone is part of the digital economy. My research team, several of whom are right here on the call. We also have a competitive mountain biker, just to make sure that Will is not alone. Our competitive mountain biker is Chris Compton, who will shortly be speaking. Joining him will be Christina Filipovich, and then we have Ravi Shankar Chaturvedi and Abhidami Adrisa. And I'm sure there are others who are probably on this call who I'm forgetting. But we have a small team, but we are trying to shine a light on the gap that exists here in the U.S., in every county, every zip code of the United States. And it's shocking for us to realize that even though people talk about the digital divide, very few, whether it's at the federal level or even at the state level, quite understand how wide that divide is. And not only how wide the divide is, but also the reasons for the divide. We see there are many reasons why people are not on the right side of the divide. For some people, there is no infrastructure close to their home, which allows them broadband access, which allows them the ability to do what all of us are doing, basically getting on a Zoom call, which is so important, not just for connecting on for work reasons, but for kids to attend school, for patients to talk to their doctors, or simply stay connected with friends and family, as we have all realized. The reason why they're unconnected, it could be because of infrastructure. It could be because they are not, they can't afford it. Or it could be because they simply aren't aware enough of the importance of having a broadband connection. And even if a service is available to them, they don't want to put up the money because they don't see any value in it. So we want to understand what are the different drivers of the digital divide and really how wide the divide is. And we have taken upon ourselves to put data against the digital divide, data that currently is incomplete, it's spotty, and the FCC is slowly coming up the curve. Unfortunately, it is slowly coming up the curve. So this is such an important moment for all of us, because we have a historic opportunity to close the divide, and we want to make sure that the money gets allocated where it's most needed. So with with that as just a backdrop, let me turn this over to my colleagues Christina and Chris to share with you the work that we've been doing, and we'd love to have this work be available to you so that you can put in your own inputs, and you could prepare the appropriate proposals and share it with your colleagues and with those in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, so that we can have a fairer allocation of this historical money that has been allocated by Congress, and finally get to narrow that divide, if not absolutely close it. So over to you, Christina and Chris.
Thank you very much, Bhaskar. Thank you for the context and for the introduction. So to introduce myself, my name is Chris Compton. I'm a research analyst here at Digital Planet, and I was one of the primary researchers on our Bridging the Broadband Divide dashboard that we're going to present to you today. So I'll kind of start by saying, please feel free as I go through this kind of step-by-step introduction to the tool to drop any questions in the chat. And Francella, if there are any that you want to pause me on, just use the raise hand function, and I'll be sure to grab you and get those taken care of. But with that, let's jump into it. So our goal, as Bhaskar was saying, with the Bridging the Broadband Divide dashboard, was to put data that is on the household experience by zip code, by city, and by state on different dynamics of the digital divide, whether it be accessibility, for which we use speed test data, affordability, for which we actually have an in-house calculated metric that estimates the percent of households that can actually afford internet, or whether it be geographic. So, different racial dynamics of a given zip code, population density of a given zip code, et cetera. So with that, I'm just going to actively go to our webpage where we have the interactive here. One second. Here we go. So the other thing that I will say is that we do have this interactive video here on our webpage that was shared with you guys prior to the webinar, and we'll make sure to get that out to you following the webinar as well. If you have any questions, it kind of walks through what I'm about to walk through here. And then we'll get to this download data portion later on in my presentation as well. So right at the top, we have the Bridging the Broadband Divide dashboard for our analysis and write up here. I do find it a little bit clearer in terms of the text and in terms of the information that we have here. If you click right down here on this Tableau link, which takes it out of our webpage and into the Tableau public webpage, and this also gives you an opportunity to share the interactive, and even gives you the opportunity to create your own, as I'll inform you on how to do, and embed that interactive in your own web page if you would like to. But with that, let's get into some of the dynamics of the interactive. So what we're looking at here is observations across the United States. Every single observation dot on the chart is an individual zip code in the United States for which we have data to display. On the y-axis, for how dots are kind of splayed vertically, is average download speed from MLabs, which is a publicly available source that calculates speed test data as Will introduced earlier. And so from this average download speed, we have the ability to characterize zip codes in different broadband zones that kind of are consistent with the FCC definitions of these broadband zones. So the first one, this first reference line, is sufficient broadband speed, which is equal to 100 megabits per second. And this is the broadband download speed at which the FCC considers if you're above that particular speed, your download speed is served. So those areas would not be in priority for getting funding. Now, the next reference line is this unserved, underserved barrier. Below this line is where you'll find zip codes that are considered unserved based on the speed test data that we have. And this is just any zip code that has broadband download speeds below 25 megabits per second, which is that FCC standard for broadband speed. And then the last is the zip codes that fall between unserved and underserved and sufficient broadband speed, which are considered underserved, which is actually where we find, in terms of the speed test data, the majority of zip codes falling in terms of these speeds experienced on average in their zip code on the ground from the speed test data. Now, on this horizontal axis, the way that we have zip code displayed is, like I mentioned earlier, this Digital Planet created metric of the percent of population that can afford the cheapest available internet plan in their zip code. And so from this, we combine income distribution data from the American Community Survey from the US Census Bureau in addition to data on the cheapest available internet-only plan from BroadbandNow to give an estimation of the percent of households that can reasonably afford internet. And we use the global standard of 2%, spending no more than 2% of your annual income on internet as being kind of that break-even point for affordability. And so from this, we get this, this matrix of different areas on the chart that a particular zip code can fall into, right? So falling into this sort of top right portion of the code, or excuse me, of the scatter plot, are zip codes that really do not need much in terms of broadband fiscal spending to bridge the divide. They already use speeds that are above 100 megabits per second, and they are well above the national average in terms of affordability. And so because of that, we would say that, fiscal money going to these zip codes would be better used elsewhere. And then at that same accord, down here is where you would find zip codes that are in the most need of funding, right? And so the last thing that I'll describe in terms of the color and the size of the zip codes is that the size of the zip codes is by population density in that particular zip code, right? So more rural, sparsely populated areas are smaller observations on the chart, while larger dots on the scatter plot are central urban areas with more people densely populated. And then the last, Francella.
While you're doing the mechanics, 2 questions in the chat. One is based on fixed or mobile test. Also, which, the question about ACS data, which set you were using is already answered. So thanks.
Okay, cool. Yeah, the speed test data is fixed. Yep. And so with that, the racial demographics for the colors of the observations on our chart. So zip codes that have the demographics of their area as primarily white, as they move closer and closer towards being 100% white, they're colored as blue on the chart. Whereas zip codes that are more and more non-white, so more racially diverse zip codes, are moved towards this sort of brighter orange color. And the reason that we do that, as I'll show you when we kind of drill into a particular area, is to just show the racial digital divide in a particular city, in a particular state, etc. So with that, users are able to actually just scroll over a zip code just to get more information on that area that they're looking at, the observation that they might be curious about. So just as a quick example, this zip code 10075 is in the Upper East Side of Manhattan in New York City. And so the download speed there is well over 200 megabits per second on average. And the percent of the population that can afford the cheapest available internet in that zip code is well above 90%, which is above the national average. So obviously this zip code does not need as much, or probably any, broadband funding as compared to, let me just scroll over here, to this zip code 10459, which is in the Bronx in New York City. So that same general area, it's in the New York City metro, right? But this particular zip code has 57% of its population that is able to afford the cheapest internet. So significantly different from that Upper East Side zip code that I just hovered over. And then the average download speed that they have in that particular area is 74.7 megabits per second, which falls into that underserved area of the chart. So with that, just kind of getting the dynamics and the different statistics that make up our chart, I'd like to just go into a quick example about.
Sorry, Chris, before you move into the example, let's just pause for a moment and see if there are any outstanding questions, because we have poured an enormous amount just on this visual, and I just want to make sure that people are following along.
If anybody has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And the 2 that were in the chat, I got to.
And you can always ask questions at the end, or get in touch with us later. So don't worry about it. Okay.
Wait 1 second. We just have a question from Megan. So Megan, if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, or I'm happy to ask if you drop it in the chat. Oh, we have 2 questions now. Megan, we'll go to you first.
Hi. Sorry, I'm having trouble getting off mute. I really appreciate the methodology and the way that you've approached this, and would love to follow up more to see where and how you see this map, nationally, but certainly in the case of New York, being used to support further comments and conversations about about digital discrimination and digital redlining, because the points that you've made between the Bronx and the Upper East Side are very much the result of long-term historic disinvestment. So just wondering if that has also been part of the conversation of how you see the utility of the map.
Thank you. And actually, in our analysis, we go into so that write-up that we have over here that I started on. We actually do talk about historical, redlining versus current digital redlining in Detroit, and comparing some of the data that we have embedded in our interactive versus what historical redlining looked like in Detroit. So I absolutely think that is part of analysis that can be, done further for the possibility of looking into digital redlining. Yes. Thank you for the question. Yeah, thank you, Christine.
If I could add something to that, Chris, that's a really good question, and it gets to the broader point that we're making in our analysis, which is that the current approach to funding, what it ends up doing is really prioritizing miles over people. So you're prioritizing, what we're seeing is these tiny little blue dots, which represent rural areas with not a lot of people, typically mostly white people. When you have in sort of that middle band and what is considered underserved, you have these big sort of beige or orange and sometimes blue dots that represent, areas where more people are. And those are sort of second in line. So part of our whole point is to say, when states are considering how to allocate this funding, you have to be very strategic about thinking about how do we reach the most people, and also do it in a way that isn't exacerbating the issues of disinvestment and historical issues of redlining as you approach. So one reason we ran through it pretty quick, but we created this map in Tableau is so if advocates or folks like you want to bring up New York and put it on your own website and make the point and highlight some zip codes, you can make that exact point to other decision makers. So sorry, go ahead, Chris. I think we had one more question in line.
We have one more question from Yen.
Hi, everyone. I'm from OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates, and I wanted to ask if you broke down any of the ethnicities or any smaller, more detailed breakdowns of the people of color that were included, and also like on this map, on like what I'm seeing right now, without your explanation that the more orange part is saying that there are more people of color, and the blue part is saying that there are more white people in the area. It doesn't really say the whole, it only says % of zip and then C. So without your explanation, I wouldn't have figured out what that would mean, what the colors would mean.
That
makes sense.
Thanks. I can answer that question first, and maybe Chris, you can chime in this time. We'll reverse it. For your second point, that's good feedback. We can try to edit it to make it a little more clear that's getting to the racial dynamics. To the first point, that's a really good question and really valid point. I think, as you know, part of it is we're limited by the data that the census is releasing by zip code. And so they tend to release things as Asian in like that very general term, which most of us know within what the census is calling Asian, the subgroups have sort of the most diversity of outcomes. So whether that's economic outcomes, education outcomes, access to broadband, there's a bunch of diversity within this group that we call Asian. And that's something that we're aware of. And I think we'd love to do a deeper dive on it. we are limited by the data that we have available to us. So I think it's something that we continue to push. I think we've even added it to the write-up if you read our analysis. And I know, I'm not sure if you said you were from New York or somewhere else. I know New York State, I think, just passed a law saying for a lot of the data collection, you have to get to a more detailed level of ethnicity. So it's one thing, you know, as advocates that we continue to push. So we hear you. We wish we had the ability to do better, but we'll keep making that point too.
Thank you, Christina. Yeah, that's excellently said. Yeah, the other thing that I will say is that in our data download that I'll briefly show you guys how to access to get the spreadsheet that actually powers this interactive and has summary statistics as well by city and by state. We have the raw data for what actually makes this interactive, right? So we have the ability to do further analyses from that particular data set. So thank you guys for your questions. I'll make sure. So what I'm going to do now is just, since this is the entire US view, I just want to show what it looks like to select a single state, since most of us are going to be, you know, focused specifically on one state. So what you do to do that is go to this select state drop-down menu and unselect all, and then select the state of your interest. We'll just say Alabama in this particular case. And so the same ideas happen, but all of the observations that are outside of Alabama are now filtered out. These are only zip codes that are within Alabama that we have on our scatter plot now. And so that gives state policymakers to see, you know, the dynamics specifically within their state of affordability on the horizontal axis and accessibility in terms of download speeds on the y-axis. What we have here as well for reference lines vertically is what the national affordability average is, which is just under 80% in terms of the percent of individuals that can afford internet in the United States based on our calculations. And immediately the state policymaker in Alabama can see that there's a much larger affordability issue for you know, the population of Alabama as compared to the national average, just because of how far to the left the median for Alabama's affordability issues are right there. Now, the other thing that we have that I have not shown yet is the map view, which is definitely helpful from the state perspective. Now, this just splays out all of our zip codes as different colorations based on where their broadband zone is, right? So green zip codes are those served zip codes, which have download speeds above 100 megabits per second. Yellow zip codes are underserved zip codes between 25 and 100 megabits per second download speed. And then red zip codes are unserved zip codes, so below 25 megabits per second. And then finally, for this last portion of the interactive, we have summary statistics that I think are pretty helpful in terms of getting context for you know, the different dynamics of affordability and accessibility issues by different metropolitan areas within the state, right? So that is the city level table right here, where each of the cities are listed, and the percent of their unserved population based on summations of all the zip codes within those cities are there. You know, the percent of the served population is there. So 1 minus that would be the percent below, or yeah, the percent below 100 megabits. And the population that cannot afford the cheapest internet is also listed there for the policymakers' view, just to compare different areas of the state to see where the largest accessibility and affordability challenges are. Do you guys have any questions there? Should I pause for anything in the chat?
We're clearing the chat for the moment.
Okay, cool. So what I would like to do is just show you all how to kind of take this out of the interactive and have it for your own use.
Chris,
okay.
A note from Bert. It says the legend shows served, unserved, and unserved, but parts of the map are not in any of those colors, like Rice, Washington.
Yes, yes. So for any zip code that we have missing data for in terms of speed test data, for the functionality of the interactive, those aren't in the interactive, but those are available in our download, interactive data download. So you can see where there are data gaps, and then we have data that isn't actually visible on the interactive, but might be helpful for different policy analyses as well, right? So for Rice, Washington, just as an example, maybe they don't have MLab speed test data available to see what download speeds are in that particular area, but they might have Microsoft broadband usage data, which is the percent of persons in a given zip code that, based on downloading Microsoft content, have their speeds above 25 megabits. And maybe they have that for Rice, Washington. And then we might also have an estimate for Rice, Washington on affordability. So there are certainly data gaps throughout the interactive, like we're all, trying to fight ways to find, but the interactive spreadsheet will be helpful there. And that's a great, yeah.
Good points, because I don't want to slow you down, but it might be worth saying, how do you define served? And then also we have a note in the chat about how do you chart uninhabited land?
Okay, so defining served is based on MLab speed test data, the average download speed being over 100 megabits per second from on fixed broadband. So that's the definition of served. And then uninhabited lands, that is, what I would say on that is all of our data kind of powering this interactive is from speed test data and Census Bureau data. So if there isn't a zip code associated with that particular area of the United States, then it wouldn't show up on the interactive. That's what I would say there. So with that, I will show you guys how to just quickly get this particular spreadsheet onto your computers just to have for your access. So there's the download data button right here, which takes you to a public folder on Box. And there are these 3 dots right here with the download, or next to this spreadsheet, which you'll just click this download button here to pull it up on your computer. For the sake of time, I already have it downloaded. And so we have data at the zip code level, which has all of our observations for available zip codes, even if there are missing data points in the map. We have our city level data, which is kind of that summation in that summary statistics table, which is over 400 different core-based statistical areas as defined by the Census Bureau, and sums up zip code data into unserved, underserved, and served city population, and then has that affordability aspect as well. And then we have the state level data, which is just all 50 of our states in Washington, D.C., and the national summary table. So yeah, that's the interactive data for you guys to show. And then Christina, did you want to talk about just an individual city view?
Sure, happy to. I'll pause and see if there are any other questions or comments, reaction, and then we can walk you through how to do an analysis on an individual city.
And Christina, maybe we'll move on to Q&A in the next 4 minutes. So if that's good for you, we can also take them then.
Sure. We'll just do this very quickly. So up until this point, Chris has shown you how to do an analysis of an entire state. You can also look at an individual city or a couple cities next to each other. So I think to make it easy, Chris, why don't we go with Los Angeles, where I'm based? And I think I saw one other person was calling in from there. And so through the interactive, you do the exact same thing as you do for a state. You can just type in your city or scroll through, and you can see both the map view and the chart view, which we're seeing here. I know we also had someone from Santa Barbara, so we could add Santa Barbara to the greater Santa Barbara area to the view as well, as you'll see here. You don't see too many additional dots come up. But essentially what you can do here is then hover over each of these dots and you'll see individual zip codes. So here you have the 90005 zip code in LA, and as a big orangey dot towards the top, you can see that you have high speeds, but because it's so far to the left, that zip code is facing affordability issues. So if you were a planner, you probably wouldn't be dedicating infrastructure funding here, but you'd rather want to focus on how do we get more people access to the affordability plans. So if you want to switch to the map view quickly, Chris, this is just another way to look at it. We've highlighted Santa Barbara up there too. And to reiterate, green is over 100 megabits, yellow is between those two lines, and red is considered unserved based on our speed test data. I will mention again, we have a YouTube video of this, so you can walk through it very slowly, stop and start. We dropped a lot of data and information on you. We're going to be sharing our email addresses, so feel free to reach out if you have any specific questions. And I think I will pause there and open it up to open discussion.
Thank you so much for walking through this. And also, I do want to encourage anybody who has questions to drop them in the chat. Will, that I saw, because we'll just back up just for a moment while people might be thinking about their questions. Will, you dropped a note in the chat that I did high five you on that, but I just wanted you to say a little bit more about why you wanted to make that point in the chat. So.
Yeah, sure. So what I wrote in the chat is about how the carriers report areas is being covered to the FCC. Which I think highlights why it's so important to be able to access data like the data that we just looked at from MLab. So carriers have to report data using Form 477 to the FCC, and I think that data is available publicly. But a carrier can report a census block as being covered if they are willing to sell at least one address a subscription above 100 megabits per second. So nobody has to be subscribing to it. It just has to be theoretically available. And it only has to be available in one address of the whole block, of the whole census block. That's not as much of a problem in a city where it's dense and the census blocks are small. But when you get out into the more rural parts of the country, census blocks can be very big. You might have one address that's just across a border and have, hundreds of households that aren't served and also aren't getting attention because it looks like they are served on a map. So that's where this sort of independent data to challenge some of those inaccurate or incomplete assumptions is really important.
Thank you so much for that, Will. And I also, go ahead, please, Bhaskar.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I didn't mean to cut you off mid-sentence, Francella, in terms of where you're going next, but we also recognize that several of you might be relatively new to this whole discussion of broadband, and several of you have been, kind of staring at these issues for a long time. So we would love to learn from you, even in this limited time, and maybe in follow-up. Where are the biggest pain points? What are some of the biggest challenges that you are experiencing as you're going about, helping your own community and your colleagues in kind of following through this process? And how can some of this work be helpful to you?
Thank you so much for elevating that question, Bhaskar. And one of the things I was going to go to next, and I saw that Santi, that you just you just turned your camera on, who's tuning in for the city of Boston. So I do want to give you space if there's anything that you guys want to announce. We know at Next Century Cities that city of Boston has been a leader in working on not only digital equity, but also asking questions about broadband data. So if you do want to jump in, Santi, please do unmute yourself, because I know that you just came on camera. So now you're probably hiding. Okay, so probably. And then for the questions that are in the chat, and especially to Bhaskar's point, if anybody wants to share, what are your pain points? What are the things you're working on? I do worry all the time that we're having these conversations and that it's glossing over a lot of people where they're like, I just started on this and I'm not really sure what's my step one. And so my question was actually going to be, what do you recommend for local leaders who might be completely new to this issue and are taking their first steps? And I also wanted to point out, in addition, in the chat, one of the comments that was dropped in, we have Peter Favorito. Will the Affordable Connectivity Program enrollment data from USAC be factored into this data set in some fashion, since many folks have been able to utilize the broadband services from that program?
Regarding that, yeah, I can start with Peter's question. I mean, so we haven't thought about further additions to the dashboard at this time, but I mean, that's obviously a very important data set to be incorporated. So, we have to just have internal discussions about ways to improve the interactive moving ahead and ways to improve the data set, the database that I shared with you on Excel going ahead as well. But any way to improve it is certainly in consideration.
And another note that that just popped into the chat, that's Bert from Stevens County, Washington. A major pain point is the lack of resources for grant research and submissions, learning like this and other necessary activities, and advocating for broadband and appealing for funding. So if you guys have any thoughts on that, and also that's something that you might have thoughts on, Will, as well, working with local officials.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we hear from local partners who do a lot of like ACP outreach. So like there are grants available through the FCC for organizations doing ACP enrollment and promotion. But yeah, I mean, applying for federal grants is like, it's work. It's hard. It takes a lot of time, and you have to know how to do it. I don't have a good answer like nationwide. I'd say if you are one of the people in Massachusetts, feel free to reach out to MAPC or even to whatever municipality you live in, if you're not an employee of that municipality, and find out what resources are available. But yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that that's a major pain point. It's not always easy to access those resources.
Thanks for that, Will. And even in this last 5 minutes that we have left, I don't want to miss an opportunity to give you guys an opportunity to give closing thoughts, and I'll also capture any last minute questions that pop up. But one of the things that I want to thank you, Susan Walters, for your comment, and its suggestion to form a consortia with groups that have experience filing federal grants. As a note, I think that a lot of the times people don't always have the capacity to do grants. And I think that that's one thing that I feel like it's like once you do your first one and you actually get approved, it gets a little bit easier and a little bit easier, but it is hard to create that momentum. And Bert, to the point, the question about the recording be available, yes, we will share the recording. The question that I wanted to close with really is to ask, we'll go in the order of Christina, then Chris, Will, and then Bhaskar. In your research, thinking about not only how do we map broadband access and adoption, but then what do we do with that data, knowing that the data sets that we create will never be perfect. They will only be a picture in time that constantly need to be revisited. So in your own research, what is something that you've learned? And then also, what is the next thing you hope to pursue with that information?
Okay, I think I was instructed to go first, so I will answer that first.
I wanted to mix up the order, that's why.
Yeah, no, that's fine. It's high stakes. No, I think that's a really good question, and what we've been doing, and I think some of the questions are speaking to this too on this subject with the lack of data and the lack of quality data coming from the FCC. And so what we've done is we've sort of used the Swiss cheese approach of saying, we're going to take a bunch of data and layer it, and we're going to know that some of it's missing. So some of those pieces on the map are blank. They don't have a color. But if you download our data sheet, maybe they don't have speed test data, but we have Microsoft usage data. And so, it also happens that the places that don't have data are probably the places that also don't have great broadband or broadband at all. So I think being sort of stubborn and moving forward has been our approach. Another thing that we've sort of touched on here is that everyone's coming to this at different points in the journey. And I remember when I first started researching this, my head was sort of spinning. So that's why I keep mentioning, go look at the YouTube video, go to this other resource, because I think particularly if you're not a huge data nerd, all of this can be very overwhelming. Or if you're not used to dealing with government bureaucracy, a lot of the logic of government can be overwhelming. So I think what I've learned is just keep being stubborn, do the best that you can, make these connections, because these conversations fill in a lot of holes for me. I think, moving forward, what we plan to focus on is some things that we've already touched on, which is constantly iterating and improving this interactive and other databases. And then and a major part of that is one of the questions that I believe Yen came up, is getting a little bit better about some of the racial and ethnic views, and making that actionable too. So not just having a cool visual on our website, but having the opportunity to speak to people like the folks on this call. So with that, thanks. I think I'll pass it over. I think Chris was next in line.
And
Yeah,
Chris
what
also addressed that I just got a note in the chat that says that the data set might be outdated, the 2019 to 2020. So will you be updating your information?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the BroadbandNow is the primary resource that we use for internet, speeds and then internet pricing data. And that has not been updated since that initial release. So we have structures in place to update that into the future, is what I would say. But this is the latest available data that we have for this publicly available source. What I would say in terms of Francella's question about what we've learned and what we can take away from data is that there's always a more qualitative story behind quantitative numbers, right? Like in each of those zip codes that we were showing, in terms of the map view, a red unserved zip code in the Bronx is going to have a very different experience in terms of how they interact with the internet than an unserved location in the Adirondacks in rural New York, right? So I think the most important thing with taking this interactive in data is finding where there needs to be priorities that lie in terms of the area to look at first, and then actually digging in more qualitatively about what is being experienced on the ground. Because numbers do great at a lot of things, but the actual stories and experiences of those individuals, we need to go further than just a high level number for a lot of things, I would say.
Thanks for that. And Bhaskar, I'm going to turn to you actually, because we're pressing up against the time. I want to give you a few seconds to give your closing thoughts and then turn it to Will.
Yeah, just a couple of closing thoughts. So this has been an incredible opportunity to have a first conversation with so many of you. And we look forward to further ones. And to build on Chris's point about the narrative being important, one aspect of the narrative that we want to emphasize is that there is a distinction between the digital gap being an outcome of no infrastructure versus not enough money to afford a high-speed service versus not having the awareness or education to know that this could be useful to me and my family. So it's important to make that distinction. Second is it's also important for all of us to understand where the burden is being felt, whether it's in certain parts of a state or it's in a rural area or an urban area, whether it's falling disproportionately on certain communities, primarily communities of color, and specifically which communities within the communities of color itself. These are all important considerations. So it's really critical that we layer on these issues. In the past, we know that the FCC had been operating with very poor data. We're trying to improve that situation. The FCC is aware of that as well. So let's not let perfect be the enemy of the good, and let's continue to move forward with trying to craft the proposals for how we close the gap. Now, in terms of how we close the gap, part of this is going to come from the money allocated from Congress. The other parts of it, there just isn't enough money to close all the gaps everywhere. So we have to figure out what are creative ways in which we could close the rest of it. And some of this could come from communities themselves. It could come from public-private partnerships. It could come from new technologies that are being developed all over. And we have some insight into some of that, but more can be done. So we have to take a creative approach because there simply isn't enough money to go around to cover every single zip code that has been marked out on Chris's map. So I'd reiterate Christina's earlier point. We should emphasize covering people over covering miles. Obviously, we want to strike a balance between the two, but ultimately, this is a narrative about people. Thank you, Francella.
Thanks so much for that. And Will, you get the closing thought.
I think just very briefly, I would highlight what others have said, which is that data is a tool and it can be used to illustrate a point and make a decision, but it's imperfect. And you have to understand it in context and talk to the people in the community that it's describing. And, it is super useful, but it is not everything.
Well, thank you so much for that. And also specifically, not only to the Digital Planet team and the MAPC team, because I see Will, your colleague Stephen, is on the line as well. I just want to give a wholehearted thanks to my team that makes all kinds of magic happen in the background. Part of the team was in New Mexico yesterday talking to local leaders. Some of the team was helping in the background to make today come true. And then we'll be in DC next week. And so they make a lot of magic happen in the background. I couldn't do it without them. So Brian, our deputy director, Brittany Ray, who's running the Zoom, Ryan Johnston, who is always jumping in on federal data issues, and Corianne and Roxy, who in the background are reaching out to local and state officials all the time. We're so incredibly thankful just for your work and also to your commitment to the movement that we're building. So it has been another productive day. You are one day closer to the weekend, and we're so grateful that you joined us. So if anybody has any questions about the content for today, we will make sure that we follow up with NCC's email. So you have any questions. We've also, I know that Will shared his email in the chat. We'll also be happy to field questions for the Digital Planet team. But on behalf of Next Century Cities, we are incredibly thankful for each and every one of you and the work that you're doing in your communities. So have a beautiful day. Thanks again for joining. Bye.
Thank you all very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.